Hi, in this video I want to make I suppose, an allusion to my previous video. In this previous video I mentioned arguments, and I guess in this video I want to mention something on arguments as well. In this video I want to mention something I mentioned in passing in the previous video, and the thing I mentioned in passing in the previous video was something about arguments, and I mentioned something about how people are forced back into arguments, and they're forced back into arguments because um, if you persecute a person too much, or you get in a person's case too much, for lack of a better term, you obviously sometimes push a person to the extreme and they exaggerate, overreact, and it's more their emotions than their logic or their actual beliefs. And in many cases, it's not really honest, like I mentioned, necessarily in all cases, because sometimes it's exaggerated and you're not necessarily being honest, because it's almost pointless to be honest once you've admitted a bigotry and you're not willing to change it, even though you admit it. So that's another silly phenomenon to at least go on over. But sometimes you are forced back into an argument. Not only that, sometimes the person making the accusation that's right, say proving right or wrong, it doesn't really matter. The accusation is you're forced back into an argument where you're forced into saying a person's wrong for this particular reason, but sometimes it's always you're forced and back into an argument, almost an argument you don't necessarily believe in, because it's something even though you don't necessarily believe the argument that you're spewing, and that's what I mean in passing that I mentioned in the other video. The previous video is how people obviously resort to arguments, even though you seem to have gotten along so far. You take it a step too far. The you take your assault, your onslaught a little too far, and the person will get extra defensive. And I guess it comes down to being too offensive and very defensive, because the person will just go right back to the argument, or go right back to the beginning. Because sometimes it goes full circle. All of a sudden, you're right back to square one. You go too far, you'll go right back to the beginning. It's about taking one step at a time, finding the right way through the maze. Otherwise, you're gonna get lost, and you're gonna end up right back to where you started. I guess an argument can be alluded to like a maze, or it can be an allusion to a maze, or it can be analogized to a maze, or metaphorized to a maze. Let's go through the list. It can be something that can be compared in all those similar circumstances. So when you're thinking like that, you need to realize that sometimes they get back into a corner and they go right back to where they started. Not only that, it's all about understanding that, and like I mentioned, it is about hitting a person emotionally, and being emotional, but also being intellectual and logical when you're being emotional. Just don't, I guess when I say emotional, you use emotions, but also say don't be as forceful. You have to be simple, and not necessarily simple, but you have to say I want the best for you, or you want to include some of those words, but you have to be logical at the same time. You can't just use emotion, otherwise you're playing the game on their level. They're never going to learn the lesson. It's about understanding that logic is obviously the best way to use things, and even the most logical person can be controlled by their emotions, and they can obviously fall through the same pit traps, the pitfalls that the same person that they found so cliche and obnoxious to fall for all these emotional arguments, and use those to their advantage, and fall for the same thing that the person they were making the accusations towards before. So it's about understanding exactly where you're coming from. And I say sometimes experience is something that's good, even though it could be used against you. Your experience, you falling for the same thing, could be used against you, but it's something that sometimes takes it. And I think by default, all of us have been there to a certain extent at some point, proven wrong right to our faces, even though we can't, even though we won't necessarily admit it. Being an overt liar, being a white liar, saying something, you being caught in the act, it's still lying right in front of a person's face and denying it and changing the subject, or being backed up into an argument, admitting reality, all of us recognizing it's right in front of their face. We don't have to admit it to them. They can see it for themselves. They have eyes, they have ears. Even if they didn't, they're experiencing it. And I think even if they weren't experiencing that necessarily, even if they were a Helen Keller, they would understand to a certain extent. They have feelings. They're having some kind of sensation. And even at that point, we wouldn't be having this conversation at this point, because that person wouldn't have had all the delusions of silly psychology unless they were taught those things. And if they know all the delusions of silly psychology that a lot of people play, and a lot of people fall for, religion, whatever it is, then obviously they know enough at that point to play the games. They know enough at that point to have the argument. So if they've fallen for the delusions, the more you know, you're more likely to fall for the delusions. Not when I mean that is the fact that you have that default sense. You've started off that far, you've gone that far. It shows that you've gone that far to know enough. If you know religion, you've gone far enough, regardless of the senses you have. And take a little step further, take one step further, like the whole atheist thing. You're an atheist to every religion except your own. Just take it one step further, I guess. Take it one step further, and not fall for the one extra religion that you happen to have some kind of bigotry or bias towards. It's a bias, usually emotional, that you're falling for it. You believe it, we don't believe it. I guess atheists can be just as annoying in saying they believe it, but they don't believe it, but they kind of believe it, and they don't believe it, but they do, and I don't believe. They just use it to their advantage, and then all the Christians and all the religious people, I guess, using this as a primary example, saying they believe in something, but then they have their own interpretation, but that's not how they mean it, but they mean it, and it's just so much crap. You need to stop making this stuff up. At least the atheist and the atheist, no agnostic. The atheist, there's no agnostic, there's atheist. I don't know. There's no proof. You're just pretty much an atheist at that point, I think. But this is a possibility. That point, yeah. At least the atheist doesn't have as many holes in the argument, right? So anyway, yes, it's about backing up a person to their argument. Emotions obviously get in the way, but it's about being clever enough, I suppose. Using emotionally charged language isn't always the best thing, but sprinkling that in through there, it's almost impossible to use it to not use it in many circumstances. And when you realize, like I mentioned, full circle, like arguments like a maze, you need to realize take the right path. Realize you need every sentence you speak, every word you speak, how you speak it, and how you start it and how you end it does matter. Every single thing has an effect on everything, and how you have an effect on this can mean something. Don't be too overtly aggressive, because a person will back into an argument, a cliche argument, and it doesn't matter how cliche or obnoxious it is. It's something that someone will use to their advantage, regardless of the thing that you're using, regardless of the logic, regardless of anything you're saying. I think in many cases, if it's not the emotion, it's the aggressiveness, or vice versa. If it's not the aggressive, it's the lack of emotion and too much logic. Because you're arguing in a medium in which emotion is the only way you can really portray your feelings, or whatever it is, any thoughts you have, it's emotionally charged. That's where most of these things are coming from. They're coming from your emotions, and there's only so much you can do about that, because a lot of the time, even though the person recognizes it, they'll emotionally accept it or believe it or delude themselves, and they're using that as an argumentative tactic, even though they don't necessarily believe it. They may believe exactly what you believe. It doesn't mean that's they're going to use that as an argument. They don't want to admit it to themselves. They don't want to make it sort of like a person knowing that they're homosexual or something. Use that as an example. Right? It doesn't mean that's an example that they say they're afraid to admit that or something. The same thing is they know it's true, but they'll deny it to the end. That's what I was trying to say. They'll deny it to the end, even though they know the truth. They'll argue the facts as if they were otherwise. It's about denial in many cases, and if you see it in that case of someone denying that they're homosexual or something like that along those lines, or denying that they're an alcoholic. There's so many circumstances where you can see human denial come out, or human lies, or lies, period. And it comes out of fear and emotion. And if you can see in those particular examples, those very prominent examples, you can understand that in many cases they're just doing it emotionally. And then it can just be a spur of the moment kind of thing, where they emotionally react to a certain situation. All of a sudden they want to argue for something because they're emotionally charged. It's an emotionally charged conversation, and they want to have something contrary to believe or argue for, even though they believe, generally speaking, the same thing, even though it may be the language or how you're saying something they may disagree with, or whatever it is. They disagree with your interpretation, or how you're speaking it, or how aggressive you are. They disagree, but sometimes they don't even know how they're disagreeing. They say they disagree for this reason, even though they don't necessarily know if they're disagreeing for that reason. In many cases, the ultimate point is they'll back up and use that as an argument. They'll go back to the same argument. It's a very fickle thing. You need to be very careful. It's like a maze. You have to traverse, otherwise you may end up right back to where you are. You may end up just turning around 5 times and right back at the beginning. Oh, wait, I was here. I recognize I was here. Okay, I can understand I was here. I see the red dot in the wall. I see the exact distance and everything. I can understand because I heard him say this 5 minutes ago, or her say this 5 minutes ago when we were arguing the same thing. We're right back at the beginning now. And they get backed up into these same old arguments over and over again. So it's about making the arguments thorough, and making sure you don't go around in circles, thorough enough so that you can progress an argument. So you don't go around in circles or make a person be forced to go back to this to the go-to statement, or going back to the forced backed to corner argument. So you're backing them into a corner. If you back them into a corner, the instinctual instinct. The first instinct that come to mind is to defend yourself. And to defend yourself, you're going to argue almost aggressively back against someone, even if it's contrary to what you believe. You're going to say something opposite of them, and I think that in many cases that can be, in many circumstances, that can be the case. It can be the case that they're arguing even though they don't necessarily believe what they're arguing, or necessarily what they're arguing. Something come out of their mouth, they don't necessarily believe it, and that's the way it works. Especially when you're more of a cliche human being. Just because you're cliche doesn't mean you don't know what's right or wrong. You still know what's right or wrong, and you still make the same silly mistakes. Doesn't mean you're not cliche or obnoxiously the same old sheeple people. Because the sheeple people can still understand right and wrong. It just takes more to understand the right and wrong, or get them to do the same thing. So it's about convincing them. It's difficult sometimes, but it's something that's necessary, and I think it can be done. It just takes the right manipulation. And even though it's not intentional manipulation, it's just argumentative, typical life manipulation that you're doing. It's not a negative thing, like I'm manipulating you to the dark side. I'm just manipulating you to the point to everything's a manipulation to a point. I'm getting the point across to in the way I can. And I guess there's very bad ways to get the point across. But it's about being as honest as you can to get the point across, to get the right point across when you're on the right side. As honestly as you can to get the point across in the circumstance that you're allowed to. So be as honest as you can, unless you feel like you need to be a little more manipulative. But obviously you're forced to be manipulative to a certain extent. Because that's the very foundation of argument, is to be a little manipulative and persuasive, because that's what persuasiveness is. Obviously there's a negative connotation to manipulation, but it's the same idea. You're persuading them. I guess that's a better word to use, actually. Persuade them to the right side. But I guess in a way it's all manipulation to understand, to be cynical when the understanding and apply it to all circumstances. That's generally what we're doing, persuading and manipulating. There's only so much we can do. So yes, being backed into a corner, the back to the corner go-to argument, it's obviously best to avoid it like a maze. Try to find your way out by taking one step at a time and understanding exactly where you're arguing. And know the distinctions as well. Know the distinctions in where you're going and where you're arguing, so you don't reach a dead end. So yeah, that's all I need to say. So thank you, and if I have anything else to mention about this, like I've mentioned plenty of times before, I'll mention in another video. So yes, so thank you, and until next time. Bye.